Think about color for a minute. What's your favorite color? What kind of colors do you have around? How does that influence your perception, or even how does that communicate your personality? So that's the wonderful world of color. And we'll dive into why is it important, what are the meanings of all the different colors, and we end up discussing how to choose and to combine those colors together. And lastly, and the most important part for me is accessibility and the common mistakes that I commonly see across designers, students, and also professionals working in the field that will be great to avoid. A little bit about me before we really start talking about color. I've been a UI design mentor at CareerFoundry, and I'm a principal product designer working in Berlin since 2014. And I feel free to connect. I'm on Twitter, LinkedIn, and also Instagram, so feel free to reach out. And my work experience is pretty much centered around usability, user interface, and user experience. But I did studied general design, and I got introduced to the world of color even earlier, even much before going into product design as a design career. So I've worked in companies from e-commerce to industrial ecosystems. So you will see that if you learn about the basics of design, you will still can apply it to many different fields, no matter if we're talking about fashion or travel or industrial applications, like in the case of the last company where I was working at. Why the color is important? It's pretty much the biggest motivator in decision making. And research also shows that the users form opinions of a website in about 50 milliseconds. So this is pretty much largely based on visual appearance, where, as you can imagine, color has a huge impact. Then, therefore, it is one of the primary components of the design of a website, of a product, or anything that you can imagine. Pretty much, even before websites existed, we would apply color theory into supermarkets. So that would entice people to get specific products or go into different directions, or make people feel different things in different aisles of a supermarket. Then it's also rooted in cultural learnings, as we will see through some examples. And it sets up the tone and communicates what you want to communicate regarding a product that you're designing. Ultimately, it helps your users to remember the product. And this is what you want to also to convey, so that it's more recognizable right away. Through the meaning of color, we can see a specific examples, like the color. Think about the color that you use to go into a funeral, for example. So when you mourn in the West world, you are very likely to go dressed in black. But you will see that there are other colors that are also being used as a typical mourning dress. So if you go to different regions and traditionally to different regions. So for example, Brazil nowadays also uses black because it was westernized, but originally it will use purple. And the same in Iran, where the original mourning color was blue. So you will see that color has very, very different meanings depending on the context, not only in terms of place, but also in terms of time. So when we think of the earliest 19th century, when society was really pragmatic, and they would, for example, dress children until the age of 8 only in white. So there was no gender divide by that time. And it was simply a very practical approach, because they would simply bleach and clean the dirt much easier. Then by the time that the kids would reach 8, they would dress them in pink and blue. But then if you look at these pictures, realize that actually it's the other way around than it is nowadays. And the reason is that the red was a color that was more associated with men, because it was was seen as a stronger color, while the blue was the color usually depicted in the Virgin Mary's dresses and paintings. So there was much more association with feminism from the blue color, and the pink was used in boys simply because it was a little red color. So it was a toned down red, which was basically to indicate that it was a small little man. Nowadays, it's completely the other way around, and this comes from simply from commercial purposes, where the US decided that it will be actually much more profitable if we could sell pink clothes and blue clothes, so that if children are born in with different genders from the same family, they will have to buy all over again the same clothes. So it was actually very convenient for selling more clothes. And as you see, this is pretty much ingrained in many other meanings that we will go through. So think of it as it has a great diversity in symbolism, depending on regions, depending on times, but it also is very dependent to the context that it has, and it's also subject to change. So it can be pretty much a marketing campaign to sell more clothes that will make the meanings change completely. Some of the examples would be the danger signs, for example, where usually we see yellow in Europe in red is a color of danger signs in the US for road signs, but then we see the yellow roads, the marker in the middle of the roads being yellow. But then in Malaysia, it's actually green. So you will see that these contexts vary as well. Then we have blue as spiritual and religious connotations. So Virgin Mary, as I mentioned before, is depicted in wearing blue robes. That has pretty much to do with the color, with the fact that the color was simply expensive, and it was very costly to produce. So that was a little bit as a color that would signify much more meaning to the fact that the Virgin Mary was somebody worth the effort of, and it was expensive to, so not everybody could wear that color. And the same for political concepts or religious concepts. So you see green in Islamic world because it's also associated with paradise, and it's quite used in the Saudi Arabian flag. Then we have historical associations for the fact also from the production perspective. So because purple was a color that was really extremely costly to produce, it was more expensive than gold, because there was a lot of tiny snails that need to be captured and boiled in order to, we needed thousands of these snails in order to produce this purple color that we now know. And only the wealthy and the royalty could actually afford it. So that's why it was called the royal color for that reason. And that's why it's still nowadays associated with expensive things. And ultimately, it was the psychology of color was started to being discussed by philosophers. It was never really taken serious. It was also a little bit more from an experimental and observational point of view rather than scientific. It was only about mid through the 19th century that we start making experiments and analyze color from a scientific perspective. So as you see, Goethe simply just analyzed colors from what kind of emotions would that transmit to him, saying that red would be a color that is beautiful, or yellow would be a color that is good, and things like that. So then we do also have to consider personal preferences, right? When I ask you, what is your favorite color? Most of the times you have a pretty defined answer. And this answer is also very specific to majority of people, where we see that a lot of people actually do prefer blue. And it is It could be related to the religion, could be related to the fact that it is a calming color. We don't really know. Reality is your users do have very specific preferences. Nevertheless, it doesn't mean that you have to use that color just because user liked it, but perhaps the best would be to choose a color based on its meanings. And although the users will have a preference, they will definitely relate to product that communicates their personality, and this is the personality that you want to convey through the color. So what I'm trying to do through this presentation would be to teach you how to fish, and so don't expect a lot of examples. We'll go through the meaning of the colors, and you will see how you can adjust and find what you're looking to communicate and apply it to your branding, to your app, to your website, wherever you're using colors. So going through red, and this is the strongest and the most energizing color that's ever existed. So it is a color that enhances metabolism and raises our heartbeat and our breathing rates. It prompts a release of adrenaline, stimulates appetite. It is the color that has been mostly researched. It's been proven that even soccer teams that use red outfits win most often. So it grabs a lot of attention. It signifies fire, violence, war, anger, if used in the exaggeration. It's also the color of lust. But if we go to China and the Eastern world, we see it associated with luck. And it's very used, therefore, for traditional weddings in China and India. And nevertheless, in Germany or Nigeria, it's associated with unluckiness. So we see that depending on the context, it's quite different meanings. In China, it is a color that is forbidden at funerals, while in Ghana and South Africa, it is actually the color that you should use for funerals. If we go to the meaning of danger signs, error messages, those are normally depicted in red in UI. It is a powerful accent color, might be quite overwhelming when overused, so it should be used specifically for very important details of the interface. We see that colors have different variations regarding, we calling it only one name. A lot of times they can multiply and seen into different, it's set up with different tones. And depending on the tone, this might also communicate different meanings. So for example, if we pick scarlet, which is a vibrant red that kind of has a hint of orange, it's basically a really vibrant and energetic color. While if we pick burgundy, it's much more elegant and powerful. Then we have colors that are mid through this range, which might have a hint of blue, like crimson or maroon. But if we see them in isolation, they are still seen as red. And this is the important fact that no matter what kind of tint you add to the color, it will still influence the meaning of that color, but you still have the primary meaning as well related to it. So going through orange, it is the vibrance and energy of red combined with the friendliness of yellow. So it is a color that is associated with creativity, adventure, optimism, also quite used for budget applications. For example, we see it used in airlines like EasyJet in Europe, which is associated with cheap travel. And then so this is a meaning that is connotated with the West. But then if we go to Eastern world, it's more about religion and spirituality. So again, here we have very different colors that would signify a much more soft and light tone. And also, if we go to a darker tone, it will actually be associated more with earth and autumn. So depending on the tonality that we give to it, it might lose the vibrancy and go into a more of a different direction. It is a great color for CTAs, for call to actions, and because it is calling a lot of attention, but without being so empowering as red is, or overpowering, in fact. Then we go to yellow, which is the brightest and the most energizing color, at least from the warm colors. It is a color that conveys happiness. Think of the colors of emojis, of the original colors of the original emoji. It was definitely used. It was not by randomly selected that it was yellow. And it is, it also conveys prosperity. But in the Western world, why it is nevertheless used for danger, because it still grabs a lot of attention, but without signifying it so harmfully as red does. It is sacred. It is also royal in the Eastern world, although in Egypt, Myanmar, it's the color of mourning. So if we go to France, it signifies envy and infidelity. And it gives a calm feeling of happiness if we give it a little bit of a lighter tone. So depending, again, on what we want to convey, we might signify very different perspectives where, for example, golden would give a little bit more premium look, while a butter color would give it a more naive tonality. Then going through green, we are combining the attributes of yellow with the blue, which we will see also soon. So there we see balance and we see harmony. It is a color of nature, health, fertility, and abundance. It signifies new beginnings. And depending on the tonality, again, if we go to the lighter tone, we think of the new leaves, which usually are connected to naiveness and youth, while the darker green is more stable and represents affluence or wealth. So it is a color that is quite used for money applications. Then again, as with orange, it is a great color for call to actions. It is related to wealth, stability, renewal, and nature. It's also the color of success messages because of connotation of positive, like you can now walk in the street. It is always the green. So success is usually green. And then we do go to a tonality of blue, which a lot of times is forgotten, but nevertheless, it's still quite present in the spectrum. And because blue is quite affected, depending on the exact shade and hue, even if you think about that in Russian, there are two words for blue that are completely different. So a light blue will have one word and a dark blue will have a completely different word. So I think that blue is quite different in terms of spectrum of meanings, and we will go through turquoise in specific because it's also very present in our light spectrum of colors. So it does impact what kind of blue you select for the meaning that you want to be perceived. So the lighter blues would be more relaxed, would be more calming. The darker blues would be, or the brightest blue would be more energizing. So turquoise, because it's at lighter tone, it's also friendly and happy. It has a little bit of yellow, so it gives you this hint of happiness into it. It signifies balance and stability. It's peaceful, calming, and has the tranquility of blue, but also the growth of the green, because yellow and blue give you green. So it brings all of these positives together. That's why it's quite used as well in UI and product design. It calms the nervous system, and it also builds confidence. So if we go to tonalities, aqua would be more refreshing, more uplifting. Aquamarine would be more balancing, and a darker turquoise would be trustworthy and more reliable. Going into the blue, And here, as mentioned, it can be quite varied. It is nevertheless consistently and honest and trustworthy, a calm and responsible color. So you will see that in a lot of corporate identities. You will see that in a lot of companies that signify trust and confidence. It also is connected with high quality. Perhaps that's why a lot of technology companies, technology producers use it. It is trustworthy and dependable in the US. In the old Iran, curiously, it's the color of mourning. So nowadays it's not longer used, but it was originally. In the East Asia, it is the color of evil and infidelity. So if we go to lighter tonalities, we see something that is refreshing and friendly. So we use that color for applications like Twitter. But then darker blues like navy are very commonly used for corporate websites or designed where strength and reliability are very important to convey. Informational messages are also used in blue, simply because it is a color that is quite basic and primary, and it's still very different from all the other colors that are used for communicating messages like errors in red, warnings in yellow, and success in green. Then, as we heard before, purple, it is a color of wealth and quality, pretty much because of the historical association of how it was produced. That was required a lot of snails in order to produce a very small piece of tissue. So that's what people were using mostly. The colors were on themselves, on the covers that they were putting into their own bodies. So therefore, it is the color of mystery, magic, creativity, imagination. It combines the attribution of red and blue. It is the color of widows in Thailand and evil and infidelity in Japan. Going into tones, light purples would be associated spring, romance. So we see that a lot in some colors of the flowers that pop up in the spring. While darker tones like eggplant would be traditionally associated with wealth and luxury. Mostly because this color, when exposed to light and oxygen, would intensify and become even more vibrant and darker. So that's why it was such a royal association as well, because it will not be a color that would fade away. Quite the opposite, will be a color that will become even more intense with age. Then going into pink, it is the little red, but nevertheless, it is a color of love, but more on the sense of naiveness, more on the sense of purity and nurture. Therefore, perhaps it's widely associated with feminism. It signifies hopes. It's connected to trust in Korea. And if we go into a light blush tone, it lacks passion and energy, so it is a little bit more naive. While if we go for salmon with this slight orange tone, it's a little bit more shy but flirty at the same time. It's more youthful. And the rose would be the universal meaningful love and unity. It's a mature, very feminine and very intuitive color. And the vibrant magenta would be more connected with lust, sensual love, passion, and playfulness. Then going from the real colors to something that I would call the neutral colors, because these are usually colors connected that are not used primarily, but they're usually used as a secondary. So in backgrounds, for text. So we see commonly these neutral colors combined with vibrant colors that will then call our attention to the most important elements. And that said, nevertheless, we can still have an interface based on neutral colors, although it's not very common. It's actually much harder as well, because then it takes some effort to call users' attention to the right element. Then we do go for the first color in our traditional neutral colors will be the brown, because it's a very warm neutral. So it is connected to earth, to wood, to stone, to pretty much to all the elements that bring us comfort. And it is quite a reliable and dependable color. In the spectrum of different tonalities, we see colors that are more connected to nature, the darker they are. And this is a really good color to be used for backgrounds. So either beige or very dark brown, for typography, for also to bring warmth to your designs. If overused, though, it can actually be quite blunt and boring if the whole interface is based in tonalities of brown. Nevertheless, that's pretty much what we could tell about all of the colors. If you only use one color, it will very likely saturate the user, and there's no diversity, and everything is just very monotone. It requires more effort from the design perspective. So then going through the colors, continuing through neutral colors, the gray is the most neutral color of them all. Is very, very cool. It's also therefore quite conservative, formal. It is widely used in corporate designs and for backgrounds and also typography. So it can be, again, also blunt and boring if overused. But nevertheless, it's also very professional and formal. It can be quite sophisticated. We think of silver. It's also quite typical in corporate designs. Going into white. And here again, don't think that we can still adjust the tonality of the gray and still give a little bit of hint into the color of this gray by adding a little bit of maybe a blue or into a pebble that will be more connected to a stone, or make it a little bit warmer, like the basalt example here. And when we see them in isolation, they will still be seen as grays without having any tonality, but that tonality will somehow be implied in the slight hint that we added to it. In terms of white, it is depending on the region once again. So in the Western world, it is pure and associated with virtue. It signifies rebirth in the East, so it's completely the opposite, and traditionally the only color that the widows would allow to wear in India, because it is associated with death and mourning in the East. It is in the West associated with cleanliness, its simplicity. So we see it quite often in hospitals and medical equipment or medical products, medical applications, etc. Then it's very, very popular in minimalist design. So we see it quite often in Apple products, for example. Then if we look into the scale of gradients, we can again warm up a color or cool it down in order to convey a specific tonality, and in order to also balance other colors that we are using in our UI. So if we use a red or an orange to grab the attention of our users, we might use a snow white with a little bit of hint of blue in order to communicate, in order to balance those warm colors. In the black spectrum, it is the strongest and the most powerful color of all the neutral colors. Because of that, it signifies power, but also elegance. It is associated with evil, death, and mystery. If we think of a book that is called Evil by Design, it is, for example, a very good example how the cover of that book was represented with a completely dark background to signify mystery and to signify evil and death by design. So in the Eastern world, is quite the opposite. It signifies wealth, health, and prosperity. while in Africa, it's connected to age and wisdom. It's also associated with rebellion, and we can think of the Halloween that is quite close to the occult. In avant-garde and elegant designs, if you think of fashion, it is a color that is promptly used for those applications. It can also be conservative or modern, depending how it's used. It can be traditional or unconventional, depending on the colors that you combine them with. So commonly used for typography and any other functional parts because it's so neutral. And again, here we can see that even though it is a color that you can add some shades to it, it still will be very close to, it will not be communicated as anything else but black because it is such an overpowering tone. Going into combining colors. So now that we went through the meaning of each one of these colors, how do we ensure that we can use them harmoniously? Most important for working with color is to produce the palettes that are soft and very balanced. And as we see in this product, that as an example here, the Fabulous app, it is using quite a lot of colors, but they are still very well balanced together. We will see later in the end, towards the end, how this happens and what is the trick to convey that, to achieve that. So most of the time, oversaturated color experience would be very, very uncomfortable. So what we want to achieve is going from this left spectrum to something that is more harmonious and more pleasant to our eyes, because most of the times users will actually look into, or you want your product, your users to look into your product more often. So you don't want them to run away the first time they see it and look to the side because it was overpowering. So think about how these colors work together. And the trick to achieve that would be to use a color scheme that can be created by Adobe Color, for example. The way it works is we select a main color, we select one color, and then we select what type of scheme do we want. If we want an analogous scheme, it will be quite similar. It will be a spectrum of colors that are very close to each other. If we go into monochromatic, it will be only one color. So this is perhaps the hardest choice in order to ensure that it's not too boring, but it's also it still communicates and still grabs users' attention to the right elements. Then we can think of triad applications. So it is based on three separate colors that are equally distant on the color wheel. And the recommendation here would be to use one color as dominant and the others as accent. So there is still a primary color and the others are just added for smaller sections or less important areas. Then we have complementary scheme, which is the opposite side of the spectrums. It is a mix of those colors, so it creates the highest color contrast. The split complementary would be taking the main color and the colors next to it to its complementary. Then, if we look into proportions, it is the trick here is actually to think of, if we have a very saturated color, very bright, very vibrant orange, we should combine it with a neutral one. And the ratio here should be actually that bright colors take us much smaller areas than the colors that are more neutral. So the specific example here would be to use the 60-30-10 rule, where we use the 60 for the main primary color, which is mostly used for backgrounds, 30% for the color that is mostly used for typography and other graphic elements, while only 10% is used for the most important elements of the design, where we want to grab users' attention and interact with. In as very concrete example, we have the IBM Security Cloud application that shows us this in the dark mode, which is following the same principle. If we use it in light mode, the white and the black will just be inversed. So we will still have 60% white, 30% black or gray, and then the 10% would still be our accent color. Then going into the accessibility, which is a topic that is a lot of time forgotten, but we should definitely think about it, because not only there's a lot of people that are colorblind, and we should still cater for making sure that all our products are inclusive and we don't exclude any users, despite their vision being different from ours. But ultimately, even if you don't care about your user, you should still consider that the European accessibility law is actually something that we need to all take into account when designing our digital products. So it is essential to have compatibility with this color contrast and color usage. So what we need to consider is to not to convey meaning with only color. So one specific example is when we use a favorite button and we use the same element but just with the color difference, it will be seen pretty much the same way if it doesn't have a different design, if we just use only simply color to signify the difference. But if we use an outline, for example, colorblind users will also see that, and it will actually be clearer for everyone. So other way is to think of focus and interactive states. So how can we ensure that it is not just color and meaning through color? So one example would be to use a darker shade, for example, which will still be seen by colorblind people. The other example on the right you see is using a very different color that completely inverts it makes the, so while we were using a white text on a darker background, when we hover over this button, it would use a dark text over a yellow button, over a yellow background. And then when on click, it would simply become darker, even darker. So we also don't want to have a very big disparity between the hover effect and the click, because it's a very quick instance that happens very quickly. Then we get into color contrast, which is a very, very disputed topic, but pretty much it is a very simple factor. It is the difference between luminance, between the two colors. So the brightest luminous, the whiter will be the color. The darkest luminous, the black will be the color. It has absolutely nothing to do with the hue itself, because you could still have a light luminance for blue or a dark luminance for yellow, even though you will perhaps not call it yellow anymore, and more likely brown. Some of the tools that we can use to practice or to experiment with this color theory would be color blindly. Specifically for when we talk about accessibility, I like to use this Chrome plugin simply for to see how my apps, put myself in the user's shoes, to see how the users that would be colorblind would see specific images, specific websites. How that is that experience. Another plugin that I use, not plugin, but website that I use often, quite often in my products, it would be to check the color contrast ratio. So the way it works is you simply put the foreground color, you put the background color, and then it gives you the color contrast. It tells you if it passes the normal text, or you can only use it in large text, like in this case, if you want a really compliant application. But nevertheless, my recommendation is simply to pass the AA test ratio, because if the user is as colorblind as AAA group, or the accessibility, or if it requires an accessibility of AAA group, then it simply means that most of the times these users already are using enhancements for their software that would allow them to see other products that are more performant as well. Another example would be the accessible colors, where you provide an example, or even starts with an example, and you can just adjust it. So you give a color and it gives you a color that will match it. In the material palette, it actually checks your contrast if you should use white or black with that specific color. And in the color save, it's also quite creative, because you then simply just give one color and it gives you a range of colors that you can use with it. So typically mistakes, and this is something that I've seen through previous students, through other designers that I worked with, and in many other portfolio websites out there. The primary one is using too many colors. So don't abuse it. This is pretty much how it will look like if you use more than the necessary colors in your designs. You're simply not calling any attention to what's really important. Everything is flashing and screaming for attention in your product. And another very common mistake is adding backgrounds, adding color to the backgrounds. So we not necessarily need to use color in wide sections. Specifically, when we use it in backgrounds, it actually gets in the way. Perhaps a look that would be more modern would be to simply use a gray background, a light gray background. And if we want the input to stand out, we could make it white, and even though it's not so prominent, it will still highlight this input. Then the trick here would be to not use pure black and together with pure white. So if we look into these two examples, there is a reason that the right side is actually easier to read, because it is, even though I'm using, as you've seen in this slide, it does look like white and does look like black. Nevertheless, I'm using tonalities, or it has a little bit of tone of gray into it already, so it's not pure. My favorite is FD for white. It's a color that I very commonly use in my UI, in the products that I design. Then on the black side, it actually depends if you want to give it a more stronger feel, or you want to soften it. So it will be the grayer, the softer you want the product to be. Then another mistake is speaking about using gray, is using way too many grays. So at some point you start lacking contrast if you start using grays that are too close to each other, or more towards the center of the spectrum of gray color. So think about which interface is more appealing and which one stands out most. It's perhaps the one that doesn't overuse grays as much. Lastly, it is about contrast. And when we think of contrast, we usually think in black and white, but not only. A lot of times there's also contrast in terms of color. And the example that I see very often is using white on yellow background. So it is completely inaccessible. So please don't do that. And the reason that, speaking about contrast, the reason that this hurts your eyes, and why op art so much exploited this concept that pretty much makes it look like it's dancing in your eyes, it's because there's definitely no contrast here. So when we think about luminosity, these colors are very close to each other in terms of the grayscale, in terms of the light spectrum, in terms of luminance. So if I turn this image into black and white, and you will see that the circles are still there in some cases, it's because the tonalities are too close to each other. So they all have the same luminance. That's why they kind of vibrate in our eyes. And this is why, when mentioning the Fabulous app, I consider it so well designed, because even if we turn into grayscale, it still has a lot of contrast, and it still works. This super bright and colorful application still works really, really well together. So this is all that I have for you today. And moving forward check out, if you're interested in color, if you really like into using colors, check out CareerFoundry's UI design program. There's lots of examples. There's lots of more learnings in terms of color alone, as well as everything else connected to designing UI products. And you can definitely put all of this knowledge into practice, into designing your own projects there. So feel free to reach out and sign up. And thank you for joining. So next webinars are only a couple of weeks from now. So check out CareerFoundry for upcoming sessions. And let's start with the Q&A then.
Thank you, Olga.
I'm not sure if Jakob is
hear
around.
Me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks so much, Olga. That was so informative. So many great and positive comments in the chat.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We've got a few really interesting questions. So I'll start with the first one. How do you choose color that will appeal to a multinational and multicultural audience, given that different cultures attach different meanings to different colors?
Mm-hmm. So it is mostly about what is your main target and who you want to communicate primarily with, and what is the message that you're trying to communicate. So if your market is, if you're both in the Western and Eastern market, perhaps you should adjust. And we see that often those markets are using very different products, and perhaps that is also the reason, perhaps because the companies don't, or the products don't adjust to different markets.
Great. Are colors in UI design get influenced by colors and trends in fashion? And if yes, then how?
Yes, absolutely, because there is something called the Pantone Color of the Year, which is widely used. It is, perhaps in the fashion world, it is a little bit faster because it just becomes more redundant more often, but it's still seen as well in the UI. And it's if you look in early December and you look at the Pantone color for next year, then you will immediately start seeing this color also being used in digital products, in landing pages specifically. It's very common as well.
And let's talk about colorblind people. So does the usual method for designing change for colorblind people? How colors are considered then for these users?
So it is about conveying meaning through more than just color alone. So we want to use color because 90% of our users will see it and will relate to that color and will understand the meaning, or will simply maybe not understand, but that feeling will still be communicated to them. But we want to make sure that product is accessible by other means. So the example of the outline in the like button that I gave, for example, if you check Trello, which is an application for product for stories and tasks management, you will see that they also have a colorblind feature. So they add stripes into the lines and patterns into the lines or the backgrounds, in order to so that if you don't see colors, at least you can associate the pattern to that specific meaning.
Another comment and a question. Thanks for presenting a very nice topic. What's the best approach to choosing the best gray shades?
Best approach would be to make sure that they are not too gray, as mentioned in the example before. So if you want to have my first gray is usually the black. So as mentioned, I never really use the pure black. I usually tone it so that it's not so harmful. Even if we look into this webinar platform, we see that there is no black here. It's simply a shade of gray everywhere, with a little bit of hint of blue. So the primary function is to ensure that it is accessible and it doesn't, there is enough color contrast, or even though it's gray, that there is contrast between those grays.
Great. Thank you, Olga. When it comes to shading colors using tints and shades, are there some to avoid in commercial applications, and why?
In terms of...
so I guess if there are any tints and shades that we should be avoiding.
I would not say so. Pretty much depends on on what you want to communicate. And yes, you might want to try to communicate something and select a shade that is completely opposite. I would say if you want to, I personally despise gray. Sorry, not gray, brown. But for example, if you want to convey a natural look, brown is the color to go. And if we think of barbecue applications, if we think of fast food that is trying to signify a little bit more premium quality, we'll see that also being used with brown, for example.
Great. There are quite a few questions about different resources and different books. I know I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you have any? Maybe we can actually follow up in the emails.
I do have a book recommendation. Actually, I've listened recently a podcast which is from the 99% Invisible. And
cool.
they do have, it's probably my favorite design podcast, and they do have this episode that is The Secret Lives of Color, which is based on a book by Kecia St. Clair, which is actually Kecia explaining some things within the book or answering the questions here. I will put the link of this podcast in the chat if somebody wants to check out. So you have the book cover there as well. So I would probably say that I don't read about colors theory since university times. And nowadays you can pretty much find all this information online as well. So there's lots of resource. If you go into marketing websites, there's definitely a lot of information about color there.
Even on our blog, you can just Google CareerFoundry and color, and there's quite a few resources available on our blog. How do you balance and select colors for users with different types of color blindness? That's kind of, you kind of answered that already. Which colors do I choose for a dentist? I guess this person is designing some website or a product for a dentist client. Yeah.
Okay, so think of what do you want to communicate. It's cleanliness. It's trustworthy. I don't want to go to a dentist that doesn't know what they're doing. So my immediate thinking, what I think right away is lots of white, plenty of white in your application, and blue to convey trustworthiness.
Great. What about government?
Sorry, Jakob. And then depends on what is the audience. Is it young people and you want a lighter blue, or is much more people with a lot of wealth and you want to go into or a market that people are where the tooth are falling apart? So you actually need to use much more darker blue to convey this trustworthiness and yeah, basically it is more connected to old age applications.
I can see we must have quite a few designers in the audience. So there's another question about if you have any recommendations for a website designed for a government.
For a government, depends on what the government is trying to say. I would again refer to blue, a very solid blue, and I would then you perhaps use, if it's a government that is more traditional and wants to convey action, I would use red as a highlight, and if it is something that is more targeted to younger audience, I would use orange, for example. But if we want to convey hope, we use green, and that's perfect for CTAs. But then green and blue also needs to be quite careful.
And we have maybe time for another question. Olga, what's your favorite color and why?
Okay, then my answer there is it depends, and what is the context? For what? For what do I want this car? It's for dressing, I would say black. If it's for accent, I would say red, because I do a lot of times also not every day, I would not dress in red every day, but I do like to wear sometimes a red dress or a red accessory in order to call attention to it.
Fantastic. Olga, thanks so much again for presenting, and thank you all for attending and learning with us. We'll be sending a follow-up email with links to the recording, to all the resources that Olga mentioned during the webinar. And if you're interested in studying UI or UX, you'll be, after this webinar, you'll be redirected to our booking page where you can book a call with a program advisor, and this person will be able to answer any questions you might have about becoming a UI or UX designer with CareerFoundry. And with that, have a good rest of your day wherever you are. Good morning, good evening, and we'll see you in the next webinar soon.
Thank you, Jakob. This was great fun. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.